Assalamualaikum Sareza and hello to all of my fellow friends. My name is Muhammad Adib bin Muhammad Rosali. My metric number is 2020-983099. So today I would like to present about the human rights and business. Okay, so before I start my presentation, I would like you guys to watch this human rights and business video that I've choose from the YouTube, and let us watch this together.
According to the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the corporate responsibility to respect requires businesses to avoid and address any adverse human rights impacts with which they are involved. It applies to all businesses of all sizes in all situations. It is an international norm of expected conduct. In order to know and show that they respect human rights, businesses should have in place a policy commitment to respect human rights, an ongoing process of human rights due diligence, and processes to enable the remediation of business-related human rights harms. Human rights due diligence needs to cover different types of adverse impacts on all internationally recognized human rights. This includes impacts that the business causes, impacts that the business contributes to, as well as impacts that are directly linked to business operations, products, or services through business relationships. This focus on impacts in supply chains and other business relationships is an integral part of human rights due diligence. Actual and potential human rights impacts should be avoided and addressed through human rights due diligence, which includes 4 key steps. 1. Assessing human rights impacts. There is no single right methodology for businesses to assess their human rights impacts. What is essential is that all human rights are taken into consideration and that a human rights-based approach is applied in the assessment. Companies might, for example, integrate human rights into environmental and social impact assessment, or undertake assessments that focus exclusively on human rights. 2. Integrating and acting upon the findings. Responses to the findings in the impact assessment need to be integrated into relevant policies and practices across the business, such as human resources, health and safety, security, procurement, and so on. Ensuring organizational capacity for human rights management through training and allocation of adequate time and budget is essential. 3. Tracking and monitoring responses. Tracking and monitoring the effectiveness of responses should be an ongoing process. It is important to involve affected right holders and other stakeholders, for example, by establishing a joint community company monitoring team. 4. Communicating and reporting. Information about due diligence processes and impacts should be publicly communicated in ways that are accessible, provide sufficient and relevant information, and that do not pose risks to rights holders or others such as human rights defenders, journalists, or trade unionists. In sum, effective and ongoing human rights due diligence is the practical way in which companies can ensure their respect for human rights.
Alhamdulillah, we got to gain some knowledge again today. So how was it? How was the video? Do you guys understand that? So today I would like to go deeper about the due diligence, human rights and business. Okay, so before I begin, I would like to tell you guys what human right is. Okay, so human right is basic rights and freedoms that belong to every person in the world from birth until death. These basic rights are based on shared values like dignity, fairness, equality, respect, and independence. These values are defined and protected by the law. Okay, so the question here is, what is human rights and business? Okay, Okay, so according to the United Nations, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are set of guidelines for states and companies to prevent, address, and remedy human rights abuses committed in business operation. So as you can see on the screen right now, how to know companies provide their workers with the human rights. Okay, firstly, the business should have applied a policy commitment. A policy commitment refers to any one or more publicly available statement of the company's responsibility, commitments, or expectations with regard to respect for human rights across its activities and business relations. And second one is when the company apply human rights due diligence. Okay, so human rights due diligence is an ongoing risk management process that is reasonable and prudent company needs to follow in order to identify, to prevent, to mitigate, and account for how it addresses its adverse human rights impacts. Okay, so now I'm going deeper and details. I'm going to tell you guys about the human rights and due diligence. Okay, so basically human right due diligence is a way for enterprises to proactively manage potential and actual adverse human rights impacts with which they are involved. It involves four core components, and the first one is identifying and assessing actual or potential adverse human rights impacts that is enterprise may cause or contribute to through its own activities. And the second one is integrating findings from impact assessment across the relevant company process and taking appropriate action according its involvement of an impact. And the third one is tracking the effectiveness of measure and processes. And the last one is communicating on how impacts are being addressed. So to go more deeper, what is by identifying and assessing actual or potential adverse human rights impacts? Okay, so this initial step is conducted by human rights due diligence is to identify and assess the nature and actual and potential adverse human rights impact which a business enterprise may be involved. This purpose is to understand the specific impacts on specific people given a specific context of operations. Typically, this includes assessing the human rights context prior to proposed business activity, where possibility identifying who may be affected, cataloging the relevant human rights standards and issues, and projecting how the proposed activity and associate business relationships could have. Okay, so the second one is integrating findings. Okay, so this necessary action be taken is to prevent and mitigate specific human rights impacts at the local level, including by empowering specific local knowledge and ownership over issues. And we should also understand how the company is involved in human rights impacts and whether it is causing, contributing, or directly linked into actual or potential abuse. This has implications for what action to take in terms of seizing, preventing, and mitigating the adverse impact. Okay, so for the further info about it, basically tracking is a necessary in order for a business enterprise to know if its human rights policies are being implemented optimally, whether it has responded effectively to the identified human rights impacts, and to drive continuous improvement. Okay, so business enterprise should make particular efforts to track the effectiveness of their responses to impacts on individuals from groups of population that may be at high risk or vulnerability or marginalization. So the last one is communicating on how impacts are being addressed. Okay, so the responsibility to respect human rights requires that business enterprises have in place policies and processes through which they can both know and show that they respect human rights in practice. So, showing involves communication, providing a measure of transparency and accountability of individuals or groups who may be impacted, and other relevant stakeholders, including investors. Okay, so for me, this is important. If I am being a worker one day, I would like to know my companies protected me by applying at least some basic human rights. And because this gives me chillness in working and in at my working place, and I feel protected for my rights. That is all due diligence, human rights, and business is all about. So now let's go to the lesson learned. So the lesson that I've learned from the due diligence human rights, the first one is to create awareness. Actually, one of the things that we can spread awareness about the discrimination is by applying human rights policies in the companies. People will know it is wrong to discriminate other people, or those who do the discriminations will be punished. Okay, so the second one is to create desirable workplace environment. So human rights issues present challenges for company, as there is currently no universally adopted standard of what constitutes acceptable behavior. It is difficult to list all the rights inherent to humanity because there is considerable subjective involved and cultural differences exist among societies. But every owners of companies should protect their workers by giving them their basic human rights at least. So some basic human rights include life, freedom from slavery or torture, freedom of opinion and expression, and a general imbalance of non-discriminatory practices. And the last one is what I've learned is the security at workplace is secured. With all the human rights policies while doing your work, secure workplace automatically will be created. As you learn about the due diligence human rights, its main goal is to protect the party of the owner of the business company, and also the another party, which is the business partner. Okay, so for the conclusion, basically there is a lot of principles human rights. Due diligence human rights is one of them, and all the main goal of principle of human rights are to protect us as a human, protect us as a human worker, the owner of the business partner, and so on. So as I said before, human rights issues present challenges for company, as there is currently no universally adopted standard of what constitutes acceptable behavior. But as I said, every owners of company should protect their workers by giving them their basic human rights, at least freedom from slavery or torture, freedom of opinion and expression, and a general imbalance and of non-discriminatory practices. Okay, so the second conclusion that I can conclude is I use the operation due diligence human rights for key steps, just like I presented just now, which the first one is assessing actual and potential human rights impacts. The second one is integrating and acting on the findings. The third one is tracking responses, and the last one is communicating about how impacts are addressed. Okay, so this is important and give benefits to all the parties, not only to the business owner or the worker. Okay, so these human rights show fairness, security, and protection for us as a human. Okay, so in a nutshell, human rights policies are important for a company to apply as a worker. They want their human rights are being protected. So for example, in Malaysia culture, we tend to celebrate a lot of celebrations, right? So one of them is Hari Raya. So for Malaysian workers who are forced and not given holidays during their Hari Raya, they can use these human rights policies and protect their rights from discriminations. Just like this one case, a worker of Telecom Malaysia sued her boss because her boss forced her to work 1 hour extra without paying. So based on the contract and human right policies, the court decided that Telekom Malaysia is at fault, and the woman won the suit case. Thank you. That's all for me.